Let's go to the trade tower again, because, John, we now have what do we have? We don't... Wow.
It looks like a new plume, a new large plume of smoke.
That's the scene at this moment at the World Trade Center. Dan Daler from ABC's Good Morning America is down in the general vicinity. Dan, can you tell us what has just happened?
Yes, Peter, it's Don Daler down here. I'm 4 blocks north of the World Trade Center. The second building that was hit by the plane has just completely collapsed. The entire building has just collapsed, as if a demolition team set off. When you see the old demolitions of these old buildings, it folded down on itself, and it is not there anymore.
Wow.
Generally speaking, for a building to collapse in on itself like that, it would seem to indicate that there could have been an explosion, a bomb planted on the ground that would make the building collapse within itself.
10 o'clock Eastern Time this morning, just collapsing on itself. This is a place where thousands of people work. We have no idea what caused this.
Almost looks like one of those planned implosions.
If you wish to bring anybody who's ever watched a building being demolished on purpose knows that if you're going to do this, you have to get at the under infrastructure of a building and bring it down.
New York City, New York. The South Tower of the World Trade Center collapses to the ground in approximately 10 seconds. 29 minutes later, the North Tower follows suit, collapsing in approximately 10 seconds. The Twin Towers were composed of 200,000 tons of steel, 425,000 cubic yards of concrete, 106 elevators, 43,600 windows, and a 360-foot television antenna atop the North Tower. The core of each tower was a rectangular pillar 87 by 133 feet, comprised of 47 steel box columns ranging from 36 by 16 to 52 by 22 inches. The North Tower was completed in 1970, standing at 1,368 feet tall, and the South Tower was completed in 1973, clocking in at 1,362 feet tall, making them the tallest buildings in the world at the time. They were designed to withstand multiple impacts from a Boeing 707, which was the largest aircraft at the time. And we are told that these massive structures were destroyed by 10,000 gallons of jet fuel. A perfectly symmetrical collapse resulting from asymmetrical damage, with the collapse following the path of greatest resistance.
With that said, it was time to take a crash course in high-rise fires. It seems that high-rise fires are more common than I thought. I found hundreds of them. According to a 2011 report by the National Fire Protection Association, there are an average of 110 fires each year in buildings over 13 stories tall. According to the report, between 2005 and 2009, there were 550 high-rise fires. Of course, there are many more all throughout history, but let's talk about some of the more startling ones. Sao Paulo, Brazil, the Joelma building, 1974. Sparked by an electrical fire, the residential building burned twice as long as the Twin Towers, yet it stood. The underlying structure wasn't even weakened. In fact, it's still in use today. The MGM Grand, which is now Bally's in Las Vegas, Nevada, caught fire in 1980, killing 85 people. It's had a few facelifts and ownership changes, but the structure underneath was never compromised. It's still in use today. Los Angeles, California, 1988. What was then called the First Interstate Bank building burned for 3.5 hours. No structural failure at all. In fact, an insurance company moved in, and today it's known as the Aon Center. In 2004, the Parque Central building in Caracas, Venezuela, the country's tallest building, burned for 17 hours. The facade was repaired, and it is in use today. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, One Meridian Plaza, 1991, burned for 18 hours. It stood. Beijing, China, the Mandarin Oriental Hotel, burned for 6 hours in 2009. It stood. Chechnya's tallest building burned for 7 hours in April 2013. It stood. Dubai, Moscow, Zurich, and on and on. I was starting to see a trend. Fires don't melt steel or cause buildings to collapse. The World Trade Center has itself burned many times with no structural failure or weakening. Some significant dates include February 13, 1975, when the 9th to the 14th floors burned for 3 hours. No damage or weakening of the structure was recorded.
The fire began in an electrical wiring closet on the 11th floor. Some fire department officials and building officials here say that there's no chance the World Trade Center could become a type of towering inferno.
And in 1993, it survived a bomb detonated in a highly vulnerable area with no structural damage caused by the fires that resulted from the explosion. There was, of course, damage from the bomb, which had to be repaired, but through it all, the towers have always stood. Sometimes buildings do collapse because of structural failure, but it's usually a design problem or earthquake damage or a controlled demolition. Buildings don't come down because of fire, but when they do collapse, they tend to tip over and stay connected. After reviewing hundreds of fires, I could find only 3 occurrences of fire bringing down a steel-framed high-rise in all of history, and all 3 were on 9/11.
High-rise buildings simply do not collapse due to fire.
Collapse of World Trade Center 7 was primarily due to fire.
But there's a problem. Office and open-air jet fuel fires cannot melt steel.
A lot of things in these kind of buildings have to be fire resistant by nature. It's required by code. So there really isn't a whole lot of fuel in there to begin with.
The National Institute of Standards and Technology said that the maximum air temperatures was about 1,800 degrees or 1,000 degrees colder than what's needed to melt steel.
And it takes a blast furnace with air blowing with blowers to try to get steel to melt.
So if you have a flame at 750 degrees, you can hold that flame under a steel beam forever, and you'll never reach a high enough temperature to bend steel, let alone melt it.
This would have us to believe that these was a typical office fire, scattered office fires, if you will, that brought this building down. Since the mid-60s, I've tried to follow high-rise fires, and I'm not aware of any high-rise building that have come down as a result of fires.
And seeing black smoke come out the windows, that means that the fires were oxygen starved.
Kerosene would have burned off very quickly. What wasn't destroyed in the initial fireball would have been consumed fairly rapidly and would have only really served as an ignition for the rest of the material.
None of which would have been, in my experience as a fire protection engineer, hot enough to sufficiently soften the steel or damage the steel to result in a total collapse of the building.
Well, we're told that the planes hit the buildings and there was an explosion and a fire, and about an hour and a half later, in the case of the North Tower, the buildings collapsed due to structural weakening due to the fires. Fires in high-rises have never brought down a steel frame high-rise building at all, ever.
The bottom line is this. Steel-framed high-rises don't collapse, especially into their own footprint, because of fire. This is why builders and architects have loved steel for 100 years. A fire typically can't compromise the steel structure. Of course, 9/11 was not a typical day with typical fires. Jet fuel was involved. But the kerosene, or the jet fuel, just can't explain it. Set aside for a minute that only 2 of the buildings were subjected to kerosene. Now think of a kerosene lamp or a kerosene heater. In the history of kerosene lamps, I have never heard of one being melted because the fires were too hot. In fact, the World Trade Center fires were starved of oxygen and therefore heat. You can see it in the black smoke coming from the towers. Yet molten iron was found in the rubble of all 3 buildings. Something else had to provide the heat and energy needed to liquefy, melt, or even microscopically bend the steel in any of those 3 buildings. And unless you work for NIST, scientists agree that neither jet fuel, nor the furnishings inside those buildings could have heated the steel enough to melt it. I was starting to realize that something else must have been involved in the collapse of at least Building 7, if not all 3. At the time I was thinking, wait a minute.
My heart was pounding, my adrenaline was flowing, and I had a knot in my stomach. You know, the collapse never looked right to me, but then again, I never really thought that it defied the laws of physics. My imagination started to run wild.
Could the hijackers have wired the buildings? Maybe the government didn't want us to know how really lax their security was, and that's why they covered up this fact. Maybe it was pre-wired for some reason, but that made no sense. If it was a controlled demolition, it would explain how much of these buildings were reduced to ash. It would explain why the towers fell after burning for only an hour or so. It would explain why they imploded instead of tearing apart. It would explain why they all fell at close to free fall speed. It sure looked like a controlled demolition, in retrospect. I couldn't stop at this point. I needed to know more. Late nights, coffee, research. My life was changing before my very eyes. I had taken my very first step down the rabbit hole. Little did I know how much deeper it would go. By now I knew that fires didn't bring down the buildings. And even if fire could somehow melt steel, the buildings would not have fallen in on themselves. They would have tipped over or torn apart. I was starting to find credible people talking about controlled demolitions and the use of explosives and molten steel. My mind kept wandering, trying to imagine how all this tied together. But first, I still needed to understand more about what happened.
And what we find down there is pools of molten iron.
What does that mean?
Several tons. Exactly. What is that doing there? The first responders see it. The structural engineers see it. It's documented by FEMA, the melting of steel. Normal office fires is what's supposed to have brought these buildings down, along with jet plane impacts. But jet fuel and office fires don't produce molten iron or molten steel. It doesn't begin to melt until 3,000 degrees.
At one point, I think there were about 2,800 degrees.
See the stuff he's pulling out?
Yeah.
Red hot.
8 weeks later, we still got fires burning.
The concept of molten iron is very important here. In order to get molten iron, you have to reach unbelievable heat levels. It takes much, much more energy than you could find with any combination of burning office furniture, jet fuel, or gravity.
In the September 24, 2001 edition of People magazine, on page 34, an interview with Louis Cacciola, a 51-year-old firefighter assigned with Engine 47 of Harlem, New York, had this to say. "We were the first ones in the second tower after the plane struck. I was taking firefighters up in the elevator to the 24th floor to get in position to evacuate workers. On the last trip up, a bomb went off. We think there was bombs set in the building." Well, Louis Cacciola isn't the only firefighter who claims that there were explosives or demolition charges going off in and around the World Trade Center.
We made it at least 2 blocks, and we started running. Floor by floor, it started popping out.
It was if they had detonated.
Yeah,
If
detonated.
they were planned to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
All the way down. I was watching.
But have we seen any footage, anything that might support these particular allegations? And these allegations come from firefighters and officials that were at the scene and were in a position to know. Well, there is one very interesting piece of footage that was broadcast on CNN live while they were interviewing Tom Clancy. And the amazing thing is this footage was shown once and never seen again. Let's take a look. Now, as we look at this footage, the first thing that we want to note is that both towers are still standing. The sun had just risen in New York. It was 9:30 in the morning, so the camera is looking from the west towards the east, and the smoke is being blown towards Brooklyn, or away from the camera to the southeast. This gives you a clear view of the left side or north side of the towers in the Trade Center area. If you follow the left tower all the way down to the street level, you'll notice that you can see all the way down to the buildings below. Now the question is, if both towers are still standing and the smoke is being blown away from the towers, what is this huge plume of smoke approximately 50 to 60 stories high rising from the Trade Center area? This footage was shown once live and never repeated, as I've already said. Why were we never shown this footage again, and why has this event never been brought to the attention of the American public or the world? This is a critical event. It was never discussed or examined because it is inconsistent with a simple attack of planes slamming into towers. How could this plume of smoke be rising from the base of the towers if neither one of the towers had collapsed. There's one more important point to make when viewing this particular piece of video footage, and that is that the rising plume of smoke appears to be occurring to the north and west of the Trade Center area. Question: is there any other photographic evidence that might show an explosion or a plume of smoke that occurred to the north and west of the Trade Center towers before the collapse?
September 2000. The Project for a New American Century, a neoconservative think tank whose members include Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz, and Jeb Bush, releases their report entitled Rebuilding America's Defenses. The report calls for a massive overhaul of the United States military and encourages fighting and winning multiple theater wars. They declare that the process of transformation, even if it brings revolutionary change, is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event, like a new Pearl Harbor. 17 of the project's participants would later take positions in the next White House administration.